She stood at the front door, suitcase in hand, staring into the house she once called a home. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the finality of it all. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the hallway, mixed now with the scent of betrayal. "You're overreacting," he had said when she confronted him, eyes cold, arms crossed. But the text messages, the receipts, the lies, they painted a truth she could no longer ignore. And just like that, 20 years of marriage were reduced to silence, disbelief, and one final decision: walk away or burn it all down and rise again. He hadn't started as a gambler, not in the literal sense. But over the years, he began placing bets. On business deals, on half-truths, on other women. She covered for him, cleaned up the messes, balanced the checkbooks while he risked everything. "Trust me," he always said. And she did. She trusted until it cost her friends, opportunities, and slowly, pieces of herself. But nothing stung more than finding out his newest bet wasn't on a stock or a scheme. It was on another woman. A younger one. The one he said was just a colleague. The night she found out, it wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches. Just a numb silence that stretched between them like glass, thin, clear, and one wrong word away from shattering. She stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, the photos staring back at her, like cruel ghosts. Him and the woman. Their dinner. The hotel. Her birthday, no less. That's when something inside her snapped, not in rage, but in clarity. The man she loved was gone. In his place stood a gambler who had finally lost the one thing he didn't think she'd take back: herself. He thought she'd cry. He thought she'd beg. But she did none of that. She spent 2 days in silence, packing methodically, labeling boxes. "What are you doing?" he asked, finally uneasy. "Leaving," she said simply without looking up. "You don't get to walk away from this," he snapped. She paused, met his eyes, and with a chilling calm, replied, "I'm not walking away. I'm walking through it, and you'll wish I had just walked away." That was the first time in years he looked scared. Because for once, she wasn't pleading, she was planning. She moved into a small apartment, old hardwood floors, and creaky windows. But it was hers. And for the first time in years, she slept in a bed where lies didn't linger in the sheets. She got a job, nothing glamorous at first, but honest work. She started writing, journaling the hurt, the betrayal, the small wins. Her therapist called it catharsis. She called it survival. Every paycheck felt like a step out of his shadow. Every day she didn't call him felt like a triumph. She was no longer his wife. She was her own person now, and that was terrifying and beautiful. He, on the other hand, started to unravel. Without her there to cushion the fallout, his risky investments fell flat. The Mistress, once alluring and exciting, wasn't built for the chaos he brought. She wanted the spoils, not the storm. Within months, the cracks began to show. He called her once, twice, 20 times. Voicemails filled with half apologies and desperation. "You're nothing without me," he spat in one message. She smiled when she heard it, not because it hurt, but because it proved he was losing his grip. The more he reached, the further she pulled away. Her revenge didn't come with slashed tires or public humiliation. It came quietly, strategically. She hired a lawyer, one of the best. Turns out, years of being the quiet, supportive wife gave her access to everything: accounts, passwords, business secrets. And now she had the receipts. She handed them over to her attorney like weapons. "We'll take him apart slowly," he said. And she nodded, not with glee, but with resolve. This wasn't about destroying him. It was about finally building herself, brick by brick, truth by truth. He underestimated her, always had. Thought she was too soft, too kind, too forgiving. But he never noticed the way she watched, the way she learned. For years, she had studied his moves, not to help him win, but because one day she knew she might need to beat him at his own game. And now, she was 5 moves ahead. Every asset he tried to hide, she uncovered. Every lie he told in court, she dismantled with documents. The judge saw through him in minutes. She didn't have to scream to win. She just had to show the truth. At the final hearing, he looked at her like a stranger. Maybe because she was. The woman in front of him wasn't the wife he controlled. She was radiant, poised, untouchable. When the ruling was read, full asset division in her favor, restitution ordered, and the mistress subpoenaed for fraud, he paled. She didn't smile. She just stood up, collected her things, and walked out. Power didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be unshakable. Outside the courthouse, she breathed in the cold air, crisp and sharp. Reporters gathered, cameras flashing. "Do you have a statement?" one called out. She turned, locked eyes with the camera, and said, "I gave him everything, and he gambled it away. Now, I'm taking back what's mine. And trust me, I'm just getting started." The headlines came fast. CEO loses empire in divorce scandal. Wife outsmarts husband in stunning court battle. She didn't ask for the spotlight, but she wasn't hiding either. For years, she'd been invisible, supporting, sacrificing, surviving. Now the world was watching her rise, and she let them. Not for the attention, but for the silent women reading those headlines, the ones whispering to themselves, "Maybe I can do it too." She wasn't just a survivor. She was a symbol now, a reminder that quiet strength, when awakened, is a force no one can contain. Her phone buzzed constantly, law firms offering partnerships, media channels wanting interviews, even women's organizations asking her to speak. She declined most of them. Fame wasn't the goal. Freedom was. But one offer caught her. A business grant for women rebuilding after divorce. With that, she opened a consulting firm. Small at first, focused on helping other women navigate the legal and emotional trenches she had once drowned in. Each woman she helped was another piece of healing. Her pain had become a blueprint, and that blueprint was changing lives. One morning, months later, she walked past their old house, the one she had left behind with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. The lawn was overgrown, the mailbox stuffed with unpaid bills. He wasn't there anymore. Word was he'd left the city, tail tucked, debts piling behind him. The mistress? Long gone. She felt nothing, not pity, not revenge, just closure. That house had once held her dreams. Now it held the ruins of his lies. She didn't belong there anymore. She had outgrown every brick of that place. She went to dinner that night alone, not because she didn't have company, but because she enjoyed her own. She wore a black dress, simple, elegant, and ordered wine with confidence. At the next table, a woman was crying quietly into her napkin while a man texted under the table. She caught the woman's eye and offered a soft, knowing smile. No words exchanged, just solidarity. That's when she realized this was her power now. Not the court wins or the headlines, but the ability to see pain, recognize it, and radiate the strength of someone who had conquered it. He tried to reach her again. A handwritten letter this time, desperate and rambling. He said he missed her cooking, her laugh, the way she made him feel like a king. He apologized for the affairs, the gambling, the lies. He ended it with, "Please, can we just start over?" She burned the letter without reading it twice. She had already started over, only without him. His chapter had closed the moment he bet against her, and she had rewritten the book without needing his ink anymore. The media shifted their focus. The scandal faded, but her story kept moving. Her firm grew. She hired a team, mostly women with battle scars of their own. They didn't wear power suits to look important. They wore them like armor. Together, they helped hundreds of clients, divorced, betrayed, silenced, step back into the world with dignity and direction. She didn't just build a company. She built a haven, a place where no woman had to feel small again. One client in particular reminded her of herself. Young, bright, emotionally wrecked from a cheating fiancé who stole her savings. When the girl sat across from her, eyes swollen, voice cracking, she didn't offer pity. She offered a plan. Legal help, financial coaching, emotional support. Step by step, she walked her through the fire. Months later, that same girl returned, confident and glowing, whispering, "You saved me." But she just smiled and said, "No, I showed you the match. You lit your own flame." And while she never looked for love again, it found her anyway. Slow and unexpected. A man she met at a charity event, calm, respectful, no grand gestures, just genuine interest. He listened. He asked, not assumed. He admired her not for her past, but for how she carried it. And though fear clung to her at first, memories, hesitations, she didn't run. She learned to trust herself again, and that made trusting someone else possible. This wasn't a rescue. This was recognition. He, the ex-husband, faded into anonymity. No business, no marriage, no legacy. His name became a whisper. Wasn't he that guy who, and then silence. But she became a name spoken with reverence. A story told in boardrooms, podcasts, and quiet conversations between friends. She became the proof that rebirth wasn't a fantasy. It was a choice. And she chose it. Again and again, every time she refused to look back. On the anniversary of the day she left him, she stood alone by the ocean. No speeches, no drama, just the sound of waves and wind. She threw a small stone into the surf, engraved with one word, done. Not because she held on to pain, but because she finally released it completely. That was her closure. Not a courtroom win, not revenge, but peace. And in that moment, she smiled, not because she beat him, but because she became someone who never needed to. Her mornings began before sunrise now. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She jogged through the quiet streets, music in her ears, mind clear. Every breath she took reminded her she was alive on her own terms. There was a time she dreaded waking up, unsure what new lie or disappointment awaited. Now, her days were hers, filled with purpose, not pain. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and she didn't need validation from anyone to know she'd made it. The proof was in her peace. One evening, she sat on her apartment balcony overlooking the city. Lights blinked like stars below, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Every tear that once fell for him had watered the roots of her rebirth. Now, she cried for the woman who dared to walk through fire, for the girl who once felt small and voiceless. She toasted herself with a glass of wine and whispered, "We did it." The wind carried her words out into the night. She didn't need applause. She had her own. She published a memoir. Not for fame, but for closure. The title was simple, powerful, The Silence That Screamed. It wasn't just her story. It was a mirror for anyone who had ever been ignored, discarded, or used. The reviews poured in. Some called it raw, others brave. But what mattered most were the letters. Hundreds of women wrote her, saying, "You told my story." She read every single one, often with trembling hands. Her pain had found purpose. Her voice had become a lighthouse. One of the most unexpected messages came from his mother. A simple email. I'm sorry for everything. I was wrong about you. It hit harder than she expected. For years, his mother had blamed her, belittled her, sided with him. She could have ignored it, but instead she replied, "Thank you. I hope you find peace too." Forgiveness wasn't about letting them back in, it was about letting herself move on. And in that small act, she unlocked another door in her heart. She was invited to speak at a conference, Women Who Rise. At first, she hesitated. She didn't see herself as a speaker, just a survivor with a story. But as she stood behind the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some broken, some healing, she realized this was bigger than nerves. Her voice cracked at first, but then steadied. I lost everything I thought defined me, and found everything that actually did. The room went quiet, then erupted in applause. Not for theatrics, but because truth has a sound that cuts through everything. After the event, a teenager approached her. Shy, shaky. "My dad left us. Mom cries a lot. She says she's broken. Can I buy your book for her?" She knelt, looked the girl in the eyes, and said, "You tell your mom she's not broken. She's just not done yet." She signed the book and hugged the girl tight. In that moment, she understood her story was no longer just hers. It was a chain reaction. Every life she touched sent another spark into the world. Years passed. Her name became a quiet legend in the circles that mattered. Healing, justice, rebirth. She didn't chase wealth, but it came anyway. She didn't seek revenge, but it unfolded naturally. The more she focused on building herself, the more everything he'd stolen crumbled in his absence. Karma, she'd learned, doesn't need help. It just needs time. And she gave it plenty. She bought a beach house, not flashy but perfect. Clean walls, open windows, the scent of salt and second chances in the air. It wasn't a fortress to keep the world out, but a sanctuary to let herself in. Her friends joked it was her revenge retreat, but she smiled and said, "No, this is my return." Every seashell on the sand, every breeze through the curtains, whispered freedom. She rarely thought of him now. When she did, it wasn't with hate. It was like recalling a bad storm you once survived, a distant memory, no longer terrifying, just gone. What she remembered most wasn't his betrayal, but her own strength. The way she'd rebuilt, brick by brick, breath by breath. She was no longer the woman who begged to be loved. She was the woman who loved herself enough to leave. And perhaps the greatest revenge of all, she no longer needed revenge. She had become everything he said she couldn't be, without him, despite him, because of him. And when she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see scars. She saw power, a quiet, blazing kind of power that didn't scream for attention, because it already knew its worth. Her team surprised her on the anniversary of the firm's founding. They had planned a quiet celebration, but it turned into something far more powerful. One by one, her staff shared stories, how working there helped them leave abusive marriages, rebuild careers, rediscover their worth. She sat in silence, tears threatening, as each woman stood not just as an employee, but as a survivor. What she created wasn't a business. It was a ripple, and in that moment, she realized this was her legacy, not what was taken from her, but what she gave in return. A journalist reached out for a feature article. "We want to call it The Woman Who Turned Pain into Power." She agreed, but under one condition: tell the story, but don't make him the headline. She wasn't here to feed the past. She was here to ignite futures. The article dropped and went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was true, raw, real, relatable. Women shared it, bookmarked it, whispered about it in late-night texts and group chats. She didn't just have a voice now. She was a movement. Her parents, once skeptical of her strength, now beamed with pride. They visited her beach house, marveled at her art-lined walls, and said, "We always knew you'd rise." She smiled, not because of the words, but because of how far they had all come. Forgiveness had found space in her life, not because she was weak, but because she was free. That freedom wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet mornings, unhurried meals, laughter that didn't need approval. It was peace, earned and worn like a crown. She hosted a retreat for women who had hit rock bottom. No fancy slogans, just stories, strategies, and sisterhood. They laughed, they cried, they healed. On the last night, they built a fire on the beach. Each woman threw something into the flames: letters, photos, broken promises, and with each burn, reclaimed a piece of herself. She watched with her heart full, knowing this was the real work. Not revenge, resurrection, that sacred rebirth where pain becomes power and silence becomes song. One of the retreat guests asked quietly, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" She paused, considered. "I wish I hadn't hurt so much," she said. "But if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be her." They nodded. They understood. The price of growth is often agony, but the reward is identity. And now, she wouldn't trade hers for anything. She had bled, broken, burned, and still, here she stood, glowing, whole, unshakable. An invitation arrived from a global foundation, an award honoring resilience in leadership. She was nominated alongside CEOs, activists, and scholars. She didn't expect to win. But when they called her name, she walked to the stage in a simple navy dress, no script, no pretense. "This award isn't just for me," she said. "It's for the girl I used to be, the one who stayed too long, cried too hard, gave too much. She walked through fire, so I could stand here. And I thank her every single day." That night, she walked barefoot on the hotel rooftop, letting the city wind kiss her face. No cameras, no expectations. Just the quiet knowledge that everything she thought would destroy her had, in fact, delivered her. She looked at the stars, not to make a wish, but to honor the one that already came true. Her life. Not perfect, but authentic. Not easy, but hers. And that was more than enough. She began mentoring young girls, offering workshops on self-worth, emotional boundaries, and financial independence. "Don't wait to be saved," she told them. "Save yourself first. Anyone who truly loves you will meet you on the shore, not expect you to drown for them." Their eyes lit up. No one had ever told them that before. But she meant every word. She wasn't raising followers. She was raising future warriors. One evening, she found an old wedding photo buried in a forgotten box. She stared at it, not with sorrow, but with curiosity. "Who was she?" she whispered. "That girl in white, full of hope and dreams for someone else's life." She didn't mourn her. She thanked her, because that girl was brave enough to love, and even braver to leave. She placed the photo back in the box and wrote across it in Sharpie. She rose. And in the mirror that night, she saw not just her face, but her journey. Laughter lines carved by healing. Eyes that no longer begged. Shoulders no longer hunched in apology. She touched her reflection gently and said, "I am my own home now." And that truth, it echoed louder than any apology, louder than any revenge. She visited her old neighborhood one rainy afternoon. The streetlights flickered just like they used to, casting golden shadows on familiar sidewalks. Every corner held a ghost of her former self, walking home in silence, hiding tears, pretending things were fine. But now, she walked tall, umbrella in hand, not to relive the past, but to reclaim it. The bakery she once cried behind, she walked in, bought her favorite pastry, and smiled at the girl behind the counter. No pain clung to her anymore. Only power. That place hadn't changed, but she had. She passed by the building where he used to work. Years ago, she would have avoided it, heart pounding, memories flooding in. This time, she paused, looked up, and simply exhaled. He had lost his job long ago, caught in a scandal of his own making. Word had it, he blamed her. But the truth? He had always been the architect of his own collapse. She hadn't exposed him out of vengeance. She had just told the truth, and in doing so, gave herself permission to stop carrying the weight of his choices. In a quiet moment at home, she opened an old notebook she used to journal in. The pages were filled with desperate prayers, unspoken fears, and half-sketched dreams. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through them, reliving the rawness. But instead of crying, she picked up a pen and wrote one final entry at the end. You made it, and you're more than okay. You're magnificent. She closed the notebook gently, kissed the cover, and slid it back on the shelf. A relic of her becoming. One afternoon, she got a message from him. Just a single line. Can we talk? She stared at the screen, heart still, not stirred. She didn't respond. Not because she was bitter, but because the woman she had become no longer had anything to say to the man he still was. Some doors don't need slamming. Just silence. That silence was not empty. It was full of dignity, growth, and finality. She had already said everything she needed to, through her actions, through her healing, through her peace. She met someone new. Not a savior, not a replacement, just a partner. He didn't try to fix her. He listened. He asked, "What makes you feel safe?" instead of "Why are you like this?" And that difference, subtle but seismic, melted walls she didn't know still stood. They moved slowly, built trust like a mosaic, broken pieces, made beautiful. She didn't rush to call it love. She didn't need to. Just feeling seen was enough. For now. For always. Her laughter came easier now, like a song remembered after too long. She danced barefoot in her kitchen on Sunday mornings, made pancakes just for herself, wore lipstick because she liked the color. There was no audience, no approval needed. She didn't live for anyone else anymore. That simple freedom was the loudest kind of joy. And the world noticed. Not because she shouted her worth, but because she carried it like sunlight. Quiet, warm, unmissable. She got an invitation to speak at her old university. The same place where she'd once sat in tears, wondering if she'd ever be enough. Now, they called her a trailblazer. Standing at that podium, she smiled and said, "Sometimes we fall apart not because we're weak, but because we need space to rebuild stronger." The auditorium was silent. Every word landed like thunder wrapped in velvet. When she walked off stage, students crowded her, not for selfies, but for hope. One girl hugged her and whispered, "I thought I was broken too. Thank you." And that one sentence, that quiet thank you, meant more than every standing ovation combined, because she remembered what it felt like to believe no one saw you. Now, she was the hand reaching back. And that was everything. On her birthday, she wrote herself a letter. "You are not hard to love. You were just offering your light to people who lived in shadows. You didn't fail. You freed yourself." She folded the letter and tucked it into her journal. It wasn't about forgetting the past anymore. It was about honoring it without being bound to it. She had built a life from the ashes of one she once begged to keep. And that life, it was radiant. She ended the day watching the ocean roll in, the sky soft with dusk. No music, no phone, just her breath and the waves. Each swell whispered a new promise. Each crash against the shore sang her name, not the name he once called in anger, but the one she gave herself through fire and forgiveness. Survivor, creator, woman reborn. And as the stars blinked above, she smiled, not for anyone else, but for the girl who never stopped walking, even when it hurt. She published a book, not about him, but about the journey back to herself. It wasn't revenge porn. It was redemption poetry. Each chapter bled honesty. Each page whispered strength. Readers wrote from around the world. You told my story. You gave me language for what I've lived. I left because of your words. She read those messages in silence, hand over heart, knowing her pain had found purpose. What was once unspeakable was now unshakable. She had turned scars into sentences. And in doing so, she gave permission to thousands of others to speak. She found her joy in small rituals, fresh flowers every Friday, handwritten notes to herself taped to mirrors, and solo dinners with candles lit. She dressed for herself, laughed loudly, and danced without a soundtrack. No one taught her these things. She created them. They were love letters to the version of her who once stayed quiet to keep the peace. Now, she created peace on her own terms. She didn't wait for someone to make her happy. She became the happiness she was waiting for. When the news came that he had hit rock bottom, jobless, alone, angry, she didn't rejoice. She didn't even flinch. She felt nothing, not coldness, not pity, just a distant knowing. His collapse was inevitable. She had simply chosen to rise while he chose to rot. And in that difference, her healing was complete. She no longer needed him to lose for her to feel like she'd won. Her win was standing, breathing, creating a life that was no longer a reaction, but a declaration. She was invited to light the first candle at a women's empowerment conference. Hundreds of women stood with her, doctors, artists, survivors, mothers. As she struck the match and lit the wick, she whispered, "For every woman who stayed too long, cried too much, and still got back up." The flame flickered, then blazed, and so did they. That night, she didn't sleep. She wrote until dawn, pouring out a second book, this time not about pain but about power. Years later, a young girl stopped her in the street. "Are you her? The woman from the story?" She smiled, surprised. "Yes." The girl's eyes filled. "You saved my mother." That moment, brief and golden, lived in her longer than any award. Because healing isn't just personal, it's generational. When one woman rises, the ones after her walk easier. And in that girl's trembling voice, she heard it, legacy echoing forward. She learned to say no without guilt, to walk away without explanation, and to rest without earning it. Her boundaries were no longer fences. They were invitations to meet her with respect. Some couldn't, and that was fine. She didn't need a crowd, just a circle. Small, steady, sacred. Full of people who saw her not for her pain, but for her presence. People who didn't flinch at her fire, but warmed their hands by it. One rainy Sunday, she looked out at the world and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to life. For breaking her, for remaking her, for teaching her that sometimes the deepest love story is not with another person, but with yourself. And as the rain kissed her windows, she felt it, not loneliness, but wholeness. That quiet knowing that she was enough, that she had always been enough, even when she was unseen. Her home was filled with art, color, softness. No sharp edges, no empty walls. Everything had meaning. A vase from her first solo trip, a painting from the woman she helped escape, a note from her therapist that read, "You are worth loving without needing to be useful." This wasn't just decor. It was evidence. Proof of a life rebuilt not perfectly, but powerfully. She didn't chase aesthetic. She created sanctuary. On the anniversary of the day she left, she wrote a final letter. Not to him, but to herself. You were brave when it was easier to be broken. You walked through fire and didn't just survive, you shined. You will never go back. And you don't need to, because you are already home. She folded the letter, tied it with gold thread, and tucked it into a box marked beginnings. Because the end had already passed. And as she stepped outside, wind in her hair, a sunrise painting the sky, she breathed deep. No ghosts, no grief, just her. Alive, fierce, free. The woman he once underestimated was now a force the world celebrated, not because she fought back, but because she rose. And that, in the end, was the greatest revenge of all.